Hello, and welcome to Benthos, a game of underwater intrigue. So if you look out over a beautiful Caribbean island like this one, it might look a little bit like paradise. You can see the beautiful water, it's warm, but beneath the surface, fierce competitors are competing for control of the ocean floor. So in this game, we're going to take on the roles of either coral, shown on the left, stony animals with strong skeletons that can create habitat for fish, um, or algae, shown on the right, fast spreading, photosynthetic, and capable of shading, smothering, or poisoning corals. Both of these different groups of organisms are going to be influenced by creatures on the reef as well as events in the society on the nearby island. So in addition to corals and algae, we're also going to be making use of reef creatures like this parrotfish that can eat algae to remove them, events like carbon emissions shown in the middle here, which can help to build up the algae side towards things like mass coral bleaching that can destroy many corals at once. And even microbes can come into play, like the Symbiodiniaceae pictured on the right, which can help corals to grow faster. So today we're going to do a little gameplay overview. Hopefully it should be comprehensive enough that you could play the game directly from this video. But if not, of course, there are detailed rules included with the game. So here's the design for the packaging for the game. This is a deck building game where we're going to start out with an initial deck of cards representing our coral or algal side. And over the course of the game, we're going to improve that by adding different creatures, microbes, or events to our deck. Now, one thing that's maybe a little bit unusual is that in addition to the cards, this deck building game also includes a rather extreme number of dice. And in Benthos, these dice are used to represent and track different types of properties of our organisms and the nearby island. So the main two types of dice we're going to use are these yellow dice that are going to represent the biomass of each coral, algae, or reef creature on the reef, and these purple resistance dice that will serve as sort of a temporary shield against damage that gets reset each round. So here's an example of how one of the cards look. This is a great star coral. And on the right-hand side, you can see it has a little shield icon. So each card that we play will always add, that's a coral, algae, or reef creature, will always add a biomass die set to 1. We're not really rolling these dice, we're just kind of using them as counters. For any of these organisms that have that purple shield, we'll also add a resistance die set to that number. So in addition to those biomass and resistance dice, you'll also see some dice of other colors. These 3 represent properties of the island. So the card on the left is the island. It's going to be right in the middle of our gameplay area, and we're going to be kind of playing around it. Throughout the game, there may be certain events that tell us to add awareness, global warming, or villages to the island. So for example, this carbon emissions card tells us to add 1 global warming to the island. So the first time a card like that occurs, we just add a die of the corresponding color to the spot next to that property on the island. The next time it happens, we just increase the number on the die just to keep track of how many global warming have been caused. And the reason that's important is that in the late game, having high amounts of global warming, awareness, or villages will unlock new event cards that you weren't previously able to play. So some cards will have a little banner in the upper right and only be capable of being played if there's, for example, a certain amount of global warming on the island. So in this case, this sort of second level of global warming would allow for mass coral bleaching, a horrible thing in real life, But a wonderful thing for the algae player in this game because it can destroy many corals at once and open up a lot of space on the reef for algae to spread. So here's just kind of an overview of how the game might look once it's set up. We're going to put down the island in the center of our playing area. Um, I've kind of shown around it little piles of rocks. Those aren't actual game components, but just kind of showing the spots where we can play coral and algae, um, touching that island by either a side or a corner. Both me and my opponent here have piles of biomass and resistance dice handy, so we can add them to our corals and algae and creatures as we play them. We each have our own deck, and at the start of each round, we're going to draw 4 cards from our deck that are going to serve um, as the way in which we're going to do different kinds of action. In addition, on the right, there are 2 recruit rows. These are places where we can get more powerful new cards to add to our deck. The first one starts out open. The one on the far right that has a little die on it, that Reef 2 deck, is locked until the 3rd turn, and then it will also open up, and we'll have an additional 5 cards to choose from. Cool. So over the course of the game, we're going to be playing corals and algae onto this reef, marking their health with biomass counters, and taking different types of actions in order to play the game. At the end of each round, we're going to score based on whether or not we have more coral or algae than the other player. If we have more, we're going to gain 1 victory point, represented by an 8-sided die for each player. If we're tied, we both gain a victory point. So there's that victory die. Let's say the algae player had 7 victory points. They've won this round. They have more algae than there are corals on the reef. So they just go up to 8 victory points and would win the game immediately. And that's sort of a brief overview of some of the features of this game. So now let's try doing a more detailed walkthrough now that we hopefully get kind of the basic idea. So first things first, setting up the game. So all the cards in that box are going to come in a single stack. And so we're first going to just find a nice spot to play with plenty of room. We'll need a spot that has enough room for about 5 cards by 5 cards. And if we just put the box down there on the table, we can start getting the cards out. And the first thing we're going to do is separate them out into different decks just based on the icon on the far right of the card. This is the only time we're going to refer to that particular icon, so it's a little bit small, but hopefully it should be pretty easy to separate them based on that. So here's an example of how that might look. We've got all our cards here. We're looking at that icon on the far right. And we eventually pull them apart. We should have a deck of corals, a deck of algae, a Reef 1 deck that mostly has reef creatures and microbes in it, and a Reef 2 deck that has a lot of more intense human impacts that can happen later in the game. And we also have an island card that's going to go right in the center of the board to start us out. So if I was the coral player, I'd take this coral deck and shuffle it up, and my opponent would take that algae deck and do the same. We'll grab our dice. We'll sort of make sure there's enough room to place stuff around the island. Here I've got a coral deck, and my opponent has an algae deck. Kind of leave spots right next to that, because each time whenever we need to discard a card, we're going to just kind of put it in a pile next to the deck, where it'll be shuffled back in next turn. And we're going to have those 2 recruit rows. So these are places we can get new cards to add to our deck. The Reef 2 recruit row will start with a die with the number 2 on it. at the beginning of the game. And from the Reef 1 deck, we're going to go ahead and draw 5 cards and lay them out in a row. The order isn't important, but these are going to be cards we can add to our decks throughout the game. Then we're going to draw a starting hand. That's going to be a hand of 4 cards. They're going to represent the means by which we take actions. If you're ever in a situation, which can happen, where you don't have enough cards in your deck to draw, you simply lose that particular opportunity to draw. If you find that happening a lot, it can be a good idea to recruit more cards to your deck. All right. So in Benthos, then, once we're all set up like this, play is going to proceed in rounds. We're going to take turns playing a card. And there are 3 separate types of actions we can do with the card. The first of those is simply to play it. So for coral, algae, or creatures, we just put it right onto the reef. And we can also play microbe or event cards. So here's an example of a staghorn coral. You can see in the upper right, it has this little pile of rocks or a benthic icon, indicating it likes to live on the ocean floor. Cards like that need to be played next to the island. In contrast, this Mithrax crab has a low breaking wave. So it can be played either next to the island or next to a benthic organism like the coral. So you can sort of have coral and algae in those spots right by the island, and crabs and fish and so forth next to them or next to the island. Some cards have special abilities when they're played, so do go ahead and check the rule text. For example, this staghorn coral lets you grab a new card for your deck when you play it. So just to illustrate how that action would happen, let's say I was going to play this great star coral. It has that pelagic icon, or sorry, benthic icon, so I have to play it by the island. So I could play it up here. More specifically in Benthos, we'd say that this card has to be played nearby the island, where nearby simply means touching by an edge or a corner. And we would add that yellow biomass die and the purple resistance die to the card when we first play it. Now that play icon is handled slightly differently for a lot of microbes and events. For example, this phage card just allows you to take it to sort of achieve a specific effect immediately when it's played. And after that, the card's discarded into your discard pile. And you can tell that these 2 cards, a nutrient pollution would be another example of that. And you can tell that these 2 cards will act in that way because they don't have that benthic icon in the upper right of the card. Some other cards for events and microbes have an infinity symbol in the bottom right. These are cards that will stick around round after round and provide you some benefit. So for example, coral nurseries let you search your deck for a coral and put it into play. Whereas these Vibrio microbes let you deal damage to something on the reef at the end of the turn. So if you get one of those, just go ahead and play it in front of you, but off of the reef where it's visible to everyone, and you'll get a chance to use it at the end of each round. Now, space around the island is quite limited. And so pretty quickly, it's going to fill up. And we're going to need to either use fish or microbes or events to get rid of some of our opponent's cards, or start to recruit cards like that into our deck for later in the game. However, you can't block your opponent from playing near the island using fish or crabs or that kind of thing. If there's some sort of a pelagic card, one of those ones with the wave on it, that's near the island, blocking a space, and you want to play a coral or algae there, you simply push it 1 square into a free space nearby. So for example, there's a moray eel up on top of the island. If I want to play a coral there, I would simply push it 1 square in any direction away from the island. And of course, I would again add my biomass and resistance to it. The second way we can use a card, instead of playing it directly, is to discard it to take a recruit action. So to do this, we would just take our card, put it into our discard pile. Then we'd look through this recruit row and find something that we think would be a nice addition to our deck. So for example, this parrotfish could eat algae. So that might be useful to remove some of our opponent's card. So if that's the one we wanted, we just place it into our discard pile. And then we'd immediately pick a new card from the top of the Reef 1 deck to replace it, so that that recruit row always has 5 cards in it. Finally, we can discard a card to take the third type of action, which is a develop action. And this makes some coral, algae, or creature card that's already on the reef grow. So for example, we have a great star coral on the reef, and it's right next to this Dictyota algae. Maybe we want to grow that coral larger, have it gain in biomass. To do that, we would first check out the card, especially on the very bottom. So corals and algae are phototrophs. They can grow without eating. Some other cards, like many of our fish and crabs and sharks and so forth, have to eat something to grow. So in this case, we simply pick another card we want to discard it, and then our card will grow. However, many cards also have special abilities when they grow. Those cards are marked with this little up arrow with a plus in it, indicating growth. And so if you see that symbol, make sure and read the rules right next to it to see what happens when it grows. For example, this one, whenever it grows, needs to deal 1 damage to a nearby coral or algae. So as long as there are only algae nearby, that's a great thing for us. So I'm discarding a card, and we're growing this great star coral. Now, whenever you develop a card, you turn it sideways to indicate that it can't be developed again until the beginning of the next round after we've played all our cards and reset everything. If a card effect causes it to grow, it can still increase in biomass, but we can't develop it again with an action. Now, unlike corals and algae, most creatures on the reef need to eat in order to grow. So let's check out how that works. Let's say that our opponent had a coral snail right next to our great star coral, kind of touching it by a corner, and it wanted to take a bite. They would discard a card from their hand, in this case, this sargassum algae that they just put into their discard. They turn their coral sideways to indicate it's exhausted because it's developed, just meaning that it can't be developed again this turn. And then, if you want to eat something, let's walk through how that works. So the first thing is, in order to eat something, it has to be one of your types of prey or preferred types of food. So at the bottom of each card that needs to eat in order to grow, there's an icon for what type of food it likes most, down to what it likes least. In this case, the coral snail only eats coral. Preferred food is to the left, closer to the mouth of that eel. So you want to match that icon up with the icon of the card that you're trying to eat. So we're trying to eat a coral. Its coral icon matches what this coral snail eats, so that coral snail is able to eat it. You'll also want to check any rules listed in the card if it has that sort of chompy mouth symbol. For example, this coral snail is slow moving, so it can only eat cards that are nearby it. Other creatures can eat things anywhere on the reef, unless the rules say otherwise on that card. Once you take a bite of something, you deal damage to it equal to your biomass. So if the snail had been bigger, it would have dealt more damage to the coral. That damage is subtracted first from resistance dice, and then if any is left over, it reduces biomass. And if a card ever goes down to 0 biomass, it's immediately destroyed and goes back to the discard pile. In this case, we've only managed to damage the temporary resistance of this coral, and it will reset at the end of the round. After you finish dealing damage, look to the number that has a plus next to it in the lower right of the card. That's the growth rate of your creature. Then increase your biomass by that amount. If you get up to or above the number shown on the die in the lower right of the card, right above that number, you've hit maximum biomass. At that point, your creature reproduces, allowing you to draw a card. Now, because cards are the way that we take actions, reproducing is extremely powerful. And so if you can keep cards around and grow them up until they can reproduce, that can give you a major advantage. So there's that maximum biomass. And again, anytime you would exceed that maximum biomass, you instead reproduce and draw a card. Cool. So that's how that would look on the actual board. And they would draw a card from their algae deck because it was their creature that reproduced. We're going to continue in that vein until we have no more cards in hand. If some of our actions make us draw cards, that means we might have a few more actions that we can take during the round. But eventually, everybody's going to run out of cards. So at that point, if anyone has a card that had that little infinity sign in the bottom right that's hanging out and has an end of round ability, we would now take turns activating those. So the player whose turn it is can choose one of any end of round abilities that they have to activate. After they're done, the next player would do so. And we would continue like that until all players were out of end of round abilities to activate. So for example, this Vibrio microbe in the lower left has an end of round ability that deals 1 damage to a coral or algae. So if we kind of zoom in on it here, you might see that little hourglass on the banner. That's just sort of a hint that in the rules, there's some information that's important at the end of the round. In this case, it says at the end of the round, deal 2 damage to a coral or deal 1 damage to any other card on the reef. And it's always the player who's activating the card who gets to pick which, exactly how that happens. So in this case, we'd look at that symbol, we'd use it as as our current end of round ability. And maybe we would choose to deal 1 damage to, for example, that pesky coral snail that was chewing on our coral. We'd reduce its biomass die by 1. It doesn't have any resistance, and that would kind of use up our end of round ability for that Vibrio, but it would still stay in play, and we can use it again next turn until somebody destroys it with another card, like a phage, for example. Again, at the end of the round, the scoring is very simple. If we have more coral than they have algae, we would gain a point, and vice versa. If we're tied, we would both gain a point. We all start out with 1 point on our 8-sided die, and when we get up to 8, then that's the end of the game. Now, sometimes it's very common to have a couple turns where you're pretty far behind in Benthos. In real reefs, they can undergo phase shifts where either coral or algae will kind of lock out the other organism for sometimes quite long periods of time. In Benthos, when you don't score a point, you get a very powerful special turn the tide action that you can use to plan and improve your deck for the next turn. So a turn the tide action lets you do 2 things. First, you can pick any recruit row that's open. And if you don't like the cards that are there, maybe you're playing coral and everything that's in the row is stuff that eats coral, you can place those cards on the bottom of that recruit deck and draw 5 new ones. In addition, you can also choose to take a free recruit action. So adding an extra card to your discard pile, they'll be shuffled into your deck for next round. And you can choose to do either one of those actions or both, and you can do them in either order. So here's an example of that. In this case, there are two algae on the board and just one coral. And so maybe we like this ancestral knowledge card that'll add awareness to the island and unlock nice conservation events late in the game, things like coral replanting or radical decarbonization or even crab vats. So maybe we take that card and then just replace it with another one from the Reef 1 deck. Finally, we reset everything for the next round. We're going to shuffle our discard pile back into the deck. So any cards we added to our discard are going to be available to us in our deck for the next turn. We're going to take any of our exhausted sideways cards and turn them right side up so they can be activated next turn. We're going to reset all resistance to its printed value, so it'll keep protecting creatures next round. And if we haven't yet unlocked that Reef 2 deck, we're going to reduce the die on top of it by 1. When it hits 0, we're going to draw 5 cards to make a second recruit row. And when people take a recruit action from then on, they can pick a card from either row. And when they turn the tide, they can pick either one of those 2 rows to refresh, send back to its deck, and draw 5 new cards. Other than that, the game just continues to proceed in that way until someone hits 8 points. So here's just an example of that cleanup phase. Everything happening all at once. We're shuffling things back in. We're removing exhaustion, and we're counting down until human activities become more intense on the island and that Reef 2 deck unlocks. So that's really it in terms of rules. There's a lot of fun choices that happen along the way in terms of figuring out when it's better to play more corals to try to dominate the reef or recruit fish for later in the game, whether you want to focus on the short term and get your creatures big to reproduce, or if you want to, say, build up awareness on the island so you can have humans kind of help out your side if you're the corals, and all that kind of thing. So I think it's a lot of fun. I hope you really enjoy the game, and thanks a bunch.